session. The questions shared by the members will be answered by the speaker in the second half of the session. And if time permits, we will take on the spot questions towards the end of the session. So please use the chat box feature to submit any questions that you might have for the speaker, and this will be monitored continuously. Without any further delay, I'm very excited to announce our speaker for today. Rukmini S is an independent data journalist based in Chennai, India. She has been a journalist since 2004, starting as a beat reporter with the Times of India. Rukmini received the Felix Scholarship to do an MSc in Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. In 2013, she joined The Hindu as the national data editor and the first data editor in an Indian newsroom. Rukmini has also worked at the HuffPost India and is now a columnist for Mint and India Spend. Rukmini won the Likho Awards for Excellence in Media in 2019 for data-driven reporting on changing attitudes to homosexuality. In 2020, she received an honorable mention for the Chameli Devi Jain Awards for an outstanding women journalist, and her pandemic podcast, The Moving Curve, won an Emergent Ventures India COVID-19 prize in the same year. In December 2021, Rukmini published her book titled Whole Numbers and Half Truths, What Data Can and Cannot Tell Us About Modern India. As she interrogates how data works and how the push and pull of the social and political forces affect it, she creates a blueprint to understand the changes of the last few years and the ones to come. Thank you so much, ma'am, for agreeing to be a part of what I'm sure is going to be an extremely engaging hour. So without any further delays, over to you, Rukmini, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ayushi. It's such a pleasure to be here at this particular forum. It's a pleasure to speak to people engaged in economics and policy. And it's a particular pleasure to speak to women and young women in particular. You know, the young women who I encounter are some of the most driven and passionate people who I've seen in the space. And I feel like so many of the bravest steps that have been taken in the last few years within India in particular have been taken by young women, and that's, you know, fills everyone with a lot of hope. So I'm excited to be speaking to this forum, and I'm very excited to take on questions in a little while. What I want to do today, so a couple of things, you know, what I'm going to do is not inflict another deck on anyone, and I'm just going to try and tell everyone a little bit about my journey, so that, you know, if there are questions around journalism, data journalism, being a woman in data, engaging with politics and policy, all of those things are questions that I'd love to answer. So I'm from Pune, and I took a slightly circuitous path here. I studied psychology just out of not really knowing what you do with, you know, when you're doing a BA, and sort of stumbled into it. I then studied at Sophia Polytechnic in Mumbai, where I did postgraduate diploma in social communications media. And Sophia Polytechnic then and even now was the first sort of truly political campus that I encountered. And I think, you know, a lot of you are and have been on much more political campuses, and I think, you know, that's great that sort of founding of thoughts is happening right then at the university level. So I suppose that was the first time I had, you know, P. Sainath was one of our teachers, and that was the first time I sort of really started engaging with the politics of the country. And, you know, by politics, I don't mean party politics alone. I just mean the sort of factors that govern how, life works in India. And straight out of college, the first job that I got was as an intern, and then as a reporter with the Times of India in Mumbai. I think in all sorts of jobs across the world, your early, your first job is the one at which you get sent to run all over the place, right? If you're a lawyer, you get sent to every district court for every sort of small thing. I'm sure it works similarly in other jobs. If you're a journalist, then the definition of your first job is getting sent to the most distant suburb to cover every small crime or incident that takes place. So essentially what I felt that I did in those 4 years at the Times of India in Mumbai was run around the city and watch the levers of the country, or the levers of that city at least, at work. I stood in court and to attend trials, so you sort of get a ringside view into how the legal system works. You spend a lot of time in police stations. As a young reporter, you spend a lot of time in police stations, essentially hoping that some crime is going to take place, because that gives you a story for the next day. I spent a lot of time on the night shift, for example, where my day would begin when everyone was heading home. And you'd be calling up cops, you'd be calling up fire officials, and hoping that something happened so that you'd have a story for the day. And I'm sure all of that felt like quite a grind at the time, but now I realize that what it did was to sort of put names and faces to people who I later saw in the spreadsheets that I work on. So I'll get to that in a minute. But after 4 years of doing this, I felt the need to study more, to get some sort of better theoretical understanding of how the world works. And I did a master's in development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies in the UK. And I felt like that was the first time that I encountered research and statistics around India. I don't think this is everyone's path. If some of you did, a bachelor's degree at a good university in India, you would encounter the stuff that I ended up encountering much later. But I had never read a World Bank World Development Report until then. And in that year of looking at so much excellent research around South Asia, I became convinced that this was the sort of work I wanted to integrate in my reporting when I came back. I knew I still wanted to be a field reporter and chase stories all over the country, but I felt that I wanted to take all of this research and statistics that I was looking at and integrate it. So just to give you an example, as soon as I returned, this was in the beginning of 2010, food prices were escalating across the country. And we knew this from looking at the CPI, for example. And I was sent out to cover food insecurity in Bundelkhand. And the typical way that most journalists would do this, and this doesn't take away from the work of journalists, because all of the young reporters who are sent all over the country do extremely hard work in very difficult circumstances, particularly in the last 2 years, where they've literally risked their lives to bring us the stories of the pandemic from across the country. But I felt like what I was able to do additionally was to look at data around the rises in the prices of pulses, for example, and sort of put some of that as background to the reporting I was doing on the ground. And as I did that, I felt more and more convinced that this is the direction in which I wanted to take news reporting going forward. One of my biggest areas of frustration has and continues to be around standard political reporting, which in election times tends to be, you land up in a constituency, the journalist apparently for no sort of discernible objective reason speaks to three people and sort of says this means that Jats in UP say that they're going to vote for this, and women say they're going to vote for that. And that was the sort of reporting that I was getting increasingly frustrated with, and hoping to find data that could back some of this news reporting. So that's what I did for the next 3 years at the Times of India. Again, I'm very lucky that my reporting took me all over the country. So I ended up seeing the on the ground workings of the data that I was now looking at. At the time, the Hindu was keen to expand its data reporting. We were going into the 2014 election, and it was already becoming clear that this was going to be a sort of battle of competing narratives. All elections are battles of competing narratives, but this became one in which narratives and sort of personalities really truly took hold. And the Hindu was looking for database reporting to sort of bolster its news reporting then. So I moved to the Hindu in 2013, continuing in Delhi, and in sometime later became the Hindu's data editor, where my job was to sort of marshal the paper's news reporting, including online, and sort of build a plan for it going forward. I later then worked at HuffPost, where I was also editor for data and innovation. And since 2018, I've been working independently. I now live in Chennai. I moved here in 2016. And it's interesting covering national issues from Chennai, it's also interesting seeing the southern perspective to a lot of news decisions. For example, Chennai cares very little to not at all about Pakistan, for example, or border issues, which dominate the news cycle so much in Delhi. So it's interesting being here in Chennai and sort of reforming my understanding of what national news is. Over the years, I sort of started feeling that sometimes I was having to tell the same stories over and over again. Every time there was some discussion around affirmative action for economically weaker sections, for example, class based rather than caste based, I was having to sort of pull out the same data that I had about disparities in incomes by caste status, and how, if you look at the data, then there's very little justification for affirmative action for, apart from the issues of social discrimination, which is the, underpinning for affirmative action. There's also really no sort of numerical justification, given that forward castes continue to make substantially more money than all other marginalized groups. That's one sort of example of things that I was having to pull out repeatedly. And I sort of started feeling that there should be, I should sort of institutionalize these things in one place, maybe think of a book. So I started putting together some of these things in the form of 10 big questions about modern India, and what good data can tell us about these questions, as well as what the data misses or gets wrong or misleads on, or sort of obfuscates all of those issues. And I think one thing that's happened in the last couple of years is that the number one question that I get asked everywhere is, can you believe Indian data? Is it true? Is it being fudged? Is it being manipulated? So having seen the workings of the statistical system as well, I had some understanding of what goes wrong and why, and whether this is incompetence or whether it is malice. I felt like that needed to be said, so that people can focus their attention more clearly. I think blanket suspicion about anything a government does, and about statistics in particular, is dangerous. It's pointless, it's counterproductive. You're burning all this energy and achieving very little with it. So I also felt that I needed to sort of delineate more clearly where exactly the issues with India's statistics lie. So that was the idea for the book. And in December 2021, last month, I published with Westland, and the book is called Whole Numbers and Half Truths: What Data Can and Cannot Tell Us About Modern India. I encourage you to read the book, and any questions that you have around it, I'll be happy to take. I just want to talk about a few sort of broad takeaways and lessons for me. Particularly as a woman, I wouldn't say I'm a woman in economics or policy, being not trained in either of these areas and not an expert, but as a woman who engages with these spheres. So one is, of course, I do not want to, and I sort of repeatedly want to make the point that my experience as a woman is not, equal to the experience of all women. And the vast privileges of caste and class that I have had, obviate many of the other disadvantages that I might have faced from being a woman. So I do want to reiterate that point, that when you talk about the challenges that women face, they're not the challenges that all women face. And I want to sort of acknowledge all of my positions of privilege that have helped me, continue to help me immensely, and that I try and be cognizant of. One of the things that happens in reporting, in journalism in particular, is that the sort of social conditioning of women to be good listeners sometimes really helps in journalism, because people come to you prepared to talk about deeply personal details of their lives in a way that I sometimes wonder if they would be less likely to talk to male reporters about this, perhaps because of a sort of assumption that do get these stories out as well. But I would say that this sort of social conditioning perhaps makes this hurdle a little easier for me. So just to give you an example, one of the things that many people who read the book have been struck by is a chapter on love and marriage. I mean, love and marriage is one of the portions in it. The reason that all of this is striking because the data shows us how little there seems to be of sort of free will in all of these things because of the overwhelming prevalence of arranged marriage and of very strictly within caste, within religious marriages. So it means that sort of any attempt at a interfaith, intergroup relationship is radical, is brave, and is sort of really a leap of faith to be taking in India today. And I think people reading the book have been struck by some of the stories I had in this, and of one young man in particular who's in an caste relationship, and sort of towards the end of the chapter tells me that perhaps I'm getting some things wrong because I'm looking at data on marriage, and he makes the point that he believes that there's a lot of intercaste love happening, but it doesn't necessarily end up in marriage. And some of the people, my sister-in-law, for example, when she read this, she doesn't live in India, and she was so struck by how the story had come to me. And this is something I just wanted to put out there, is that I find it so easy for these stories to come to me because I find young people, and actually not just young women, young men too, are itching to talk about love. It's one of those things that always amazes me, that I cannot get into a cab, to bring in a typical journalist example, or in any sort of setting without people with very little prodding launch into their love stories. And if you learn that you yourself have had a love marriage or an intercaste marriage, then the floodgates just absolutely open. So this is perhaps an area in which the sort of social conditioning helps women draw these stories out of people easier. And finally, I'd just like to say that in policy, you often talk about bringing in a gender perspective into something. Bringing in a gender perspective becomes much more sort of integrated to my work because I think of being a woman, or a woman who engages in these issues. So, for example, during the early days of the pandemic, one of the points that was being repeatedly made is that there was this sort of it seemed like a male-biased disease, right? Men are much more likely to be affected, both in terms of cases and in terms of fatalities. And yes, there are sort of biological explanations over there. But one of the things I found, for example, is that in the ICMR, the Indian Council for Medical Research's data, women were slightly more likely to test positive than they were to be tested. So the sort of the lower likelihood of women to access or get access to healthcare that we see across the spectrum for healthcare in India was something that I was seeing here too. And that ended up showing up in things like sero surveys later on. And it's a question for future research about whether we've missed more women's deaths rather than men's deaths in the pandemic. It's a question for research. So I think sort of having these priors helps in bringing in that gender perspective when a major news event like a pandemic comes in. So I'm really keen to get to everyone's questions. I just wanted to sort of give a broad outline of my journey to the book, and a little bit about what it's like being a woman in this field. Ayushi, do you want to throw some of the questions to me?
Yeah, and I was just about to get to that. But thank you so much, Rukmini, for sharing your journey. I think the first question that all of us were itching to ask was, of course, you've given us a great insight into what your journey has been, but what is it that inspired you to pursue data journalism as a profession? And I think equally important is what kind of pushes you to do the work that you do today and continue doing it.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And actually they have two separate answers, because I think what started me off and the sort of continuing motivation have changed over time. what started me off was this sort of feeling of there was, too much of journalism was sort of he said, she said, and narratives being pitched against each other without any recourse to what decent data could say in this, without any sense of what decent data even was. Around elections, for example, opinion polls abound, and you don't know, an ordinary reader doesn't know which one is worth talking about, or listening to, and which one isn't. So I think the absence of it at that time, and I don't want to make it sound as if I was sort of plowing some lonely journey. There are many others who've done it earlier than me as well, and part of the reason that this was a path I could take was because this path had already been forged. So at the Times of India, for example, there was already a small team of reporters called the Times Insight Group, which continues to function even today. And essentially, I learned all that I know about data, having not been trained in math, statistics, economics, any of that. I learned it all on the job from my boss at the time there, who continues to head that team, Shankar Raghuraman. So the absence of it in broad news is what brought me into it then. But what I think has really struck me, and a change that I've seen since I started it, uh, is the sort of enormous reader appreciation and feedback for data stuff. And I mean, no matter what sort of journalism you do, there's going to be a lot of people who push back against it, who don't like what you're saying. All of that does happen. But I do think that there is like a broad shift across which side of the aisle you stand on, that people want to see more data told in a credible fashion, with some degree of fairness and some degree of openness and transparency. People really do want to see this. So I've been very struck with this over time, and it really is the motivation. There are times that I wonder if I should sort of give the data a rest for a little while and just do field reporting for a few months, and just do that for a while. And I might, that's not something I've put out of the way, but every time, I mean, I wouldn't be able to think of shutting the door on data just because of the enormous response and feedback, not just to me, to everyone who works in data that we get. I mean, sure, it's not, you're not always going to have the most read story, and you still do need to do work to get people to sort of overcome some of their fears about tackling numbers. All of that does happen, but yeah, reader response is really incredible. And I think this is something we've particularly felt in the last 2 years. There's been such a clearly expressed desire among people for solid reporting using data, even in India, to the point that even something like the work that a number of us did on excess mortality, which is something that did show the government in a poor light. And the minute you show the government in a poor light, you get a lot of blowback now as a journalist. But I actually think that this was one of the issues on which there was such a desire for data that that the story actually escaped the typical echo chamber or bubble. And that is deeply gratifying when you can do that, because I think a lot of us are exhausted of talking to within our own echo chambers. We don't, we wish that that wasn't the case, and we do want to think about ways to break through that. And I think that happened with excess mortality, partly because people could, whoever you were and whatever your political beliefs, you could see the devastation in the country in May 2021. No one escaped it. So I think that was one of the examples of actually feeling that data could perhaps even break out of these very strong echo chambers that have developed in India over the last 5 years or so.
Thank you so much for that answer, Rukmini. I think you've highlighted some very interesting themes I think we'd like to touch through the course of this conversation. One of them would be that you've talked about, the gaps that exist in data, even during your journey, and probably a reason why you thought this field was where you wanted to be. I just had a question around that is, as a data journalist, how do you tackle scenarios where, you feel like the data is incomplete, sketchy, or unreliable? And how do you start understanding those areas?
So it's definitely one of those things in which you cannot give up easily, because if you wait for perfect data in India, you're going to have very little work. You're going to be able to do very little work. So so there's a few sort of hygiene checks that you typically do, and I would say government data is rarely so bad as to be unusable. Of course, there are dishonorable exceptions, like perhaps the recent GDP series, which reporting showed that we really need to think hard about whether we need to use it at all. But otherwise, most, and I will say this for Indian data, despite the sort of shaky foundations currently and the sort of consistent attacks on Indian statistical architecture, it remains standing and it remains in decent shape. So I would say that you can continue to produce decent data journalism around the things that the government produces. Of course, it's often impenetrable, but that I don't usually accept that as an excuse, because that's my job, right? I mean, my job is to take of course, in an ideal world, it shouldn't be impenetrable, whatever, we'll get there at some point. Right now, my job is to take perhaps impenetrable data, make sense of it, and put it out in ways that people find easier to engage with and access. When there is data that's sketchy, well, in a way, that's also part of my job. Pointing out the sketchiness in data is a big part of data journalism, and this is something that I appreciate. That's always been the feedback to me from editors, both at the Times of India and at the Hindu, that the job of a data journalist is not just to tell stories using data, it's also to be investigative about those very data structures. So writing about what's going right or wrong in the NSSO, for example, is an important part of a data journalist job as well. So some of my work in the last 2 years has also been pointing out flaws in how government data is being collected. I think there's a lot of sort of sort of passes that are sometimes given to privately collected data, which perhaps needs to be looked at more carefully. I think TV channels and all of the media is guilty of using opinion polls indiscriminately without applying bars or filters of quality. That's a problem, and that's really something we should stop, so that because public trust and credibility is impossible to build if you're going to equate a pew with whatever fly-by-night operator pops up just before an election. I think there are also now a few large private high frequency surveys that we are all going to increasingly come to depend on, because government data remains very low frequency in some areas. Those data sets need to be better investigated as well. Then they're not sketchy, but we need to be clearer about their sampling and methodologies. And for their part, the people producing this data also need to engage with people, and just the last sort of large source of data that remains a problem is all of the data collected by tech platforms. It's very frustrating to not have any decent access to anything, any data collected by Google, Facebook, Twitter, all of them. And you only get it in very sort of curated press releases put out by them. Now, of course, this is data that we've given by choice, and we've handed it over. So I don't feel entitled to it, but it would be good if tech platforms, to whom we give so much of our personal data, start making some of this data in a anonymized fashion available for research.
Thank you so much for that answer, Rukmini. That was quite enlightening. The one other thing you also spoke about during at the initial stages of this conversation was about how overwhelming and heartening the response was, especially during the pandemic, as to the data you were putting out. I think on that, I would also want to know, in your podcast and writing through the pandemic, and you've played a pivotal role in uncovering data inconsistencies and insufficiencies. What were some of the major challenges that you faced? I believe political pushback is something that you mentioned. And in the process, what were some of the biggest learnings that you had?
So the biggest challenge in the pandemic remains access to data. But I don't want to stop there, because I feel like we need to use a tiresome word. I feel like we need to problematize it a little bit, which is, why is this access to data a problem? And why it is because we've not been able to create sufficient democratic pressure to make this data seem as a right. And that's the real failure, according to me. Of course, the government not putting out the data is a failure, but the fact that we as a community of journalists, civil society people, academics have not been able to create a space in which a government feels that it is imperative that they give us this data is what's frustrating. So just to give you a few examples of this, and I think by the end of this you'll see just how frustrating it is. One is, of course, the fact that we don't yet have a national database of daily COVID. I'm going to give you only COVID examples, limit it even to that. We don't have a national database of granular daily COVID data. We don't have district-wise historical data, forget downloadable data available in one place. We, for the first 18 months of the pandemic, relied on COVID-19India.org. When they shut down operations at the end of October, another group of us have come together and extended it on a platform called COVID-19Bharat.org. And essentially what we do every night, all of us, is to take data from all of the state bulletins across the country and put it out in completely open fashion, both in an API as well as a front end. This is government data aggregated from government websites and government Twitter handles and government Facebook accounts, except that the government is not doing it itself. How have we come here 2 years in where it's still acceptable for the government to not have a national website of COVID data? Why did parliaments not stop for even one day over this? Why has the UP Legislative Assembly not stopped over the fact that UP only puts out its daily bulletin in the form of a PDF sent on WhatsApp to journalists? How have they got by without putting it out in public for 2 years? So it's a huge democratic failure that we've not been able to make. We've allowed governments to reach this path. I don't know what and at which level and who all share blame for this, but this is where it stands. The second example I'd give you would be about the CRS, which is the civil registration system that produces daily data on births and deaths across the country, registered births and deaths. So until a couple of years ago, this data was not digitized, and so it would only be available, in a PDF 2 years later. Now we know that it is digitized and is available at state portals across the country. The minute some of us got to know of this, we started writing about it, looking at what mortality in pandemic months and years was compared with past years to give a sort of sense of what excess mortality looked like. Now that we know that this information is available at such rich level and every day, we've still not been able to impress upon the broader country that this is data that needs to be put out right now. We cannot wait for 2 years of checks and balances and a PDF. We need this data out now, and we need this data available, accessible to everyone, not to some select IIT professor who's likely to put a positive spin on it and put it out there. We need this as public access information. So that's another frustrating one. And if you talk about facing political pushback, the most frustrating one to me has been the National Health Mission's HMIS, the Health Management Information System. It's a data set that's usually typically not looked at by journalists because it doesn't sort of produce newsworthy numbers. What it does is every primary health center and district hospital, sub-district hospital across the country produces daily or weekly information about things like immunizations, deliveries, home deliveries versus cesarean section, all of that stuff, a range of over 100 indicators. But what it also looks at is deaths. Typically, we've not used this as a resource for deaths because these are facilities that are overwhelmingly in rural areas. So it does not produce a good national estimate, but it produces a decent estimate of public facilities in rural areas. So I use this data set for two things. First is, as you'll remember, after the first lockdown, people faced, truly painful disruptions in regular access to medical care. People could not access life-saving dialysis, cancer treatments. Doctors across the country will tell you of the sort of immediate deductions in people's lifespans that happened in those months, because people were not able to access life-saving treatment, largely because of lack of access to transport, but also because some hospitals had just shut down those sections, and possibly also out of fear. So I accessed the HMIS data to show how there had been a huge fall in things like immunizations and sort of access to OPD treatments, and also inpatient hospitalizations, including for things like cancer treatments. The minute I wrote about it, that data was taken offline. Then about 4 months later, it appeared online again. And this is data we've always had. It's not some special favor that it's being put out now. It's existed since the National Health Mission has existed. Then I wrote about it a few months later to show that the disruptions eased after the lockdown was lifted, but then it hadn't gone back to the old level again, to the normal level again. Again, it was pulled offline. Then another 6 months later, it was now on a new good website, and I used that data to talk about excess mortality in rural areas. That I wrote in July, looking at data up till May 2021. After I wrote that, the government has stopped updating that website. There has been no more data, and it used to come on a monthly basis. There has been no data since May 2021. Again, how have we let this happen? So, of course, there is political pushback by, just stopping updating data and stopping to put it out. But there's also, it's scandalous that this can happen, virtually unremarked upon. I think if you polled all of India's MPs, maybe 5 of them would know that this has happened even. So it's a huge failure across the board that we've not been able to make this an issue that we've not been able to draw a line. That forget politics, information and data that was systematically put out and probably under various acts, you can't stop putting it out just because of unflattering news reporting.
That is indeed very frustrating to hear, Rukmini. And I think it's a great thing that you talked about collective responsibility. It provides a great segue to the question I wanted to ask. In a world of social media where data and statistics are shared very quickly and widely, often without context, as consumers of these data points and statistics, what are some of the things that we as consumers should be mindful of before accepting these numbers as like the whole truth and then sharing it forward?
So this is something I really struggle with, because I'm not sure how much work I can expect of a casual news reader or a user of social media. So I would encourage all of us in the community who produce things like charts, which in particular get shared widely without the news report around it, to pack in as much information as you can into that chart. And one really great example of this is the Financial Times' John Burns Murdoch, who's overall become a sort of pandemic superstar for his charts. But you'll also see the amount that he packs in, so that you would have to do a pretty dishonest crop to really sort of remove information, because so much of the context is already packed into it. So yeah, I'd say since that isn't the case with most of the information we consume, and certainly not in India, there's a few things that I would like someone with the inclination and the time to try and do. One is that if sources are not mentioned, then immediately take it with a pinch of salt. Two is the sort of persistent issue, which is the denominator effect, which is you're never told what the universe of things you're looking at is, especially when comparisons are made. And this is a point that I think is particularly important for interstate comparisons in India. I'll also say that interstate comparisons on their own tell us very little, because so much of a number is the ability of a state to report that number, right? Whether it is the empowerment of citizens to report, or the ability of the state's own machinery to capture and report data in an honest fashion. So, for example, one of the things that's been happening through the pandemic, but particularly in the last 5 to 7 days, is if you look at COVID deaths in India, it looks like only Kerala has any COVID deaths. Kerala has been doing a huge reassessment and sort of consistent audit process, and it's reporting 200 and 300 backlog deaths every day. Of course, as civil society in Kerala is doing, the Kerala government should be questioned about why these numbers didn't come out. Why should a state with decent state capacity have to take so long, and why is this backlogged information coming without any dates in it? Sure, we should ask Kerala those questions, but we should also be mindful of the fact that when you know the difference in state capacity between a Kerala and a UP, thinking that okay, UP reported 0 COVID deaths today while Kerala reported 300 means that UP is doing a great job while Kerala isn't, is problematic, and is essentially the way most interstate comparisons are reported. And lastly, I'd also say that if you are willing to take that extra step, then looking at things like sampling and methodology become important, because it's extremely expensive to conduct a representative sample survey in India. So typically, most people are likely to oversample the rich because they is much easier to access online, for example, or on phones. So if you feel that the numbers you are reading are giving you a sense of India, try and make sure that the sample is at least sort of representative of India. But yeah, I don't think necessarily the onus. As a journalist, I try to shift the onus from the reader onto me, because I know how pressed for time people are. I know the fact that statistical literacy is not something we teach in school, at school, college, anywhere at all. So it should be the job of the people producing the data rather than those consuming it.
Thank you so much for that very insightful answer, Rukmini. I think earlier on in the talk, you had also given us an example of how, people tend to generalize when you said, you speak to 2 or 3 jats and then they speak for the entire community. And also now when we talk about, people making comparisons and not really digging deep and understanding what the granularity of the data is. I just wanted to ask a little more on that. When we talk about a country as diverse and vast as ours, how do you think we should think about heterogeneity and granularity of data? Do you think there is a tendency to kind of, get swayed by averages? And how do you avoid excessive generalization while trying to draw meaningful policy insights from the data that's made available to you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think any sort of Indian average is a problematic number on its own, and there's all of the levels of heterogeneity are so enormous that I actually have great sympathies for people attempting opinion polling, for example, because to account for all of those heterogeneities would require a sort of sample of the size that not everybody is always able to produce. I think as a journalist, sometimes you sort of develop hacks, which is things that at least in a large sample set, you become used to looking for. So you become used to looking for interstate comparisons. You become used to looking for information on social groups, as the government typically calls it, because you always know that you're going to find a vast difference in whatever you're seeing, among the SC portion of the sample versus the podcast portion of the sample. Similarly for religious groups, and similarly for gender, just to draw a few of these sort of categories that you'd end up looking at. So yeah, I do think that there are many big stories that we think are Indian stories, which are actually so much swayed by one end of the distribution, and we haven't even realized that over time. So, for example, all data on Indian, whether they are estimates of income or the estimates of consumption expenditure, are so skewed by the top 1% of the country that looking at medians, for example, then means becomes essential. I think one of the problems is, I think I, for example, need to accept that that there is a lot that we are not able to, that there is a lot that we are missing. And the reason for this is typically because samples are not large enough. So just to give you an example, a respected sample survey like the India Human Development Survey can give you decent estimates for state level comparisons. But when you look at social groups, and if you try and look at social groups within states, the samples become very small. So you do have to sort of acknowledge that you are telling only a limited part of the story, and that you're missing a lot of it just because the samples for it are that small. So yeah, I think apart from truly focused surveys, or the census or something particularly large like that, there is a need to sort of accept that there is a lot of intergroup difference that you're just going to miss.
That's incredibly insightful to know. Rukmini, also when you've spoken a lot about the data, the things that we need to look at, basic hygiene checks, and also what are the qualities that we need to look at. A few questions that have kind of popped up in the chat box, I thought that I'll take those up before moving on to the next segment, is somebody asking what are the data, what are the tools that you use for data reporting? And is it only limited to secondary research?
Great question. So two things on tools. One is that I lack not just statistical skills, but also tech skills. And this is not a humble brag. I would highly recommend everybody go out and gather all of the statistical and tech abilities that they possibly can. Many of these are free courses available online. So don't be me, but this is where I am. So because of these limits, I don't do much more than Excel. And when I used to when I needed to make my own graphics, I would use again semi-free tools like Infogram and Data Wrapper, that sort of stuff. Luckily, most newsrooms or large organizations would have someone who could take you a little further than that. So I don't think this is the sort of bar everywhere. Yes, I think typically I do only secondary research, and I wouldn't even, give it as, I don't want to give it a sort of veneer of science when that isn't what I'm doing. What I'm doing is secondary reporting, I'd say. I don't even know if it's secondary research. One of the sort of rare times that I did end up doing primary research was around my work around sexual assault in Delhi. So what I found at the time was that the primary statistics that were available, and this was, after the 2012 assault, which, really galvanized the feminist movement in particular to look more closely at sort of a long, this long overdue need to talk about violence against women. But the only data that was available was from FIRs, which is the National Crime Records Bureau, which aggregates data from all FIRs in the country. And having seen in my years of reporting in Mumbai, for example, just how problematic an FIR is, just how much of sort of push and pull from families, from cops, from all sorts of forces goes into the filing of an FIR. It worried me greatly that all of us were forming our views on our own safety, the country's safety, intercity comparisons, all of that from FIRs. So what I ended up doing is, I suppose this isn't exactly primary research, but what I did here was I looked at sexual assault trials in Delhi courts. And instead of, I suppose, waiting for someone else's research on it, I wanted to answer this question for myself. So I looked at all trials involving IPC 376 in one calendar year in Delhi's 7 district courts. This was about 600 or so cases in all. And I ended up, reading all of the judgments to sort of the case papers and the judgments, and then of course also talking to complainants, accused, prosecutors, judges, to get some sense of the journey from an FIR to what courts were deciding, the sort of some of the hidden codes in what I was reading in FIRs, and the stories it told me about parental criminalization of young women's sexual agency, which I really ended up finding was an even bigger story than sort of stranger sexual assault, which is what all the conversation around 2012 ended up being. So that was one of the rare instances of doing that. I'd say another one was around elections. At one point, me and a large collection of journalists from the Hindu looked at the personal family connections of incoming MPs to try and sort of draw family trees and look at, what share were sort of sons and daughters of former MPs. But apart from that, yes, typically it is secondary research stroke reporting.
I think in the same vein, Rukmini, I'll take the liberty to pick another question from the chat box. And is how do you overcome the siloization of data so as to unlock insights which can be unlocked if the data were to talk to other data sets? So how does one overcome that?
That's a great question. And that really gets at the heart of what I feel more of data journalism needs to be, which is not reporting on one data set as it comes out, but sort of looking at what one of the stories that data set is telling you, and then looking at how it can be informed by other data that you have. So this is something I try and do a lot, and I think it's one of those things that you just gain as a skill the more you do it, and not even as a skill, it sort of becomes muscle memory, which is that you once you get used to looking at the India Human Development Survey or the National Family Health Survey often enough, you get some sense of the more qualitative-ish questions that they ask. So when you get a sense of the questions that they have on social groups and on women. So when you get something, from the NSSO, for example, which is much less insightful in these areas, it sort of clicks immediately to go to that place to, to draw on this data. So, when you're learning Excel or Google Sheets, you'll often learn a little bit about VLOOKUP and merging data sets. I think essentially what I do is doing that in my mind. I'm not actually merging data sets, but what I'm ending up doing is sort of remembering to go to the other one that talks about something that's related to this. So yeah, it's really one of those things that just by doing a lot, you get used to you get used to knowing where to go to add context to the numbers that are coming out. But it's a great question, and it's really something that I wish, it's a skill I would like to share more of, because I think it's essential to draw on these multiple sources when you're talking about something. Just like the women and COVID example, for example, you get this ICMR data on people testing positive, but you have this past information about how from the NSSO and from another study that was done in AIIMS, women are much less likely to access healthcare. You also know that families spend less on women's treatments than men. So that's immediately something, you draw into your understanding of why are we seeing fewer women? Are they just falling less sick of COVID, or could it be all of these other things?
That was very helpful to know, Rukmini. The chat is right now being flooded with a lot of questions. Just wanted to know if you'll be okay if we extend this session by another 10 minutes. I'll just take another question from the chat box. A question is, have there been times when data has made you revise your priors, where you were confronted with a situation where the findings from the data didn't align with your prior beliefs or even ideology? And how did you deal with that? Is the question that somebody wants to ask.
Great question, and something I wish all of us did more of, me included. So I'll give you an example, and this is something I'm happy to admit to and happy to talk more about. I'd say from Sophia's onwards, the sort of main influences around me have typically been left-leaning, and this isn't some sort of indoctrination. It is these are beliefs I ended up identifying with as well. So it wasn't something I was led into, but I feel like some of the questioning around left shibboleths, I didn't come to them on my own. I sort of came to them through news reporting, and then I'm glad I did at whichever point I did. So I'd say one of the ones that comes up very often for me, and now I really try to keep it front and center of my mind, is public versus private healthcare. If you've studied in a leftist university and typically talk to leftist economists, you sort of reflexively, probably without ever having had to go to a government hospital yourself, become a sort of defender to the death of public healthcare. You become convinced that the states with better capacity are making these improvements, and private healthcare is predatory, and there's this cost inflation going on, and these are the drill. This applies just the same to the public versus private schools debate, for example. So I've engaged less with the schools part. I'll talk about the hospitals part that I have engaged with. So I have, for example, did not know that people access much more private healthcare than public healthcare. The poor access more private than public. People in rural areas access more private than public. And all of my priors around the quality of care in private versus public were also wrong. It is not a fact that all costs are higher in the private sector. That's not, uniform, considering all of the out-of-pocket expenditure that does happen in any case, even sometimes when you're accessing public healthcare. It's also not a fact that those with MBBS degrees, as you would need to be typically in a public hospital, are across the board more likely to give better care than quacks in the private sector as well. So I don't want to get flooded on Twitter by outraged doctors saying that I've said that they are no good, no better than quacks. I would encourage them to read the work of Jishnu Das and others, and there's a specific argument being made here. And of course, states with better state capacity like Tamil Nadu and Kerala do better across the board. They provide better private healthcare than the north central states. They also provide better public healthcare. Costs are lower in the public sector. Costs are lower per visit in the private sector. All of that is happening more easily. But I'd say all of my priors around public healthcare were seriously challenged by reading the work of Jishnu Das and others, and then actually talking, with a more open mind to people accessing public healthcare, and just being more, just sort of opening your mind to the indignities that people sometimes have to face, and not minimizing them in some sort of greater good argument that because it's largely better for a country, or in development terms, for all of us to be strengthening public healthcare. People going through the indignities of the things that happen in some public hospitals, they are not collateral damage that we can just sort of wave away in pursuit of a broader good. So I do think that I feel more confused in a good way about this public versus private healthcare debate.
Thank you so much for answering that question, also for allowing us to overshoot a little. I think I'm going to come to my last question, and of course we can't end before talking about your book. And I feel a lot of what you've spoken today kind of feeds into the question that I've been wanting to ask. You've very vividly painted the realities that we've faced with respect to data, the tools we have, the gaps that we kind of stare at. And I think those points were also made in your book, which very effectively argues for a shift in the way we understand India and how particularly data informs this understanding. But however, at times this, the reality that we talk about is not as heartening. And you mentioned that we need to consciously work towards a shift. So I think a more higher level question for me would be to, what gives you hope that these changes and shifts will come? And, how do you stay hopeful for the future of India?
Yeah. No, I feel very hopeful, but I do want to start by saying that rather than thinking about what makes me hopeful for these changes and shifts when it comes to data, I want to think about what is the work that we need to do to make these changes happen, because it is not going to happen automatically. Nothing is going to happen automatically is something I'm increasingly realizing. Education is not going to make people more progressive in their beliefs. Urbanization is not going to make people more likely to accept intercaste marriage. These are not processes that are going to happen organically. These are not processes that will follow the pathways that they have in other parts of the world. For example, none of this is going to happen without first deciding what are the projects, the national projects you want to pursue, getting sort of collective opinion behind it, and then working really hard and figuring out what's going to make these things happen. So when it comes to the shift in thinking about data, I don't think we've taken that first step yet of creating a sort of collective ownership of it. We have not made enough people feel entitled to data. We've not made people feel like it's their right. Forget codifying it in some sort of act or legislation. We've not, there are things that bring people out to the street. We know that, and there can be effective mobilization. So if it's not happening around something like why we don't have an accurate estimate of COVID deaths, it's not because people don't care. It's because we've not been able to make it clear to enough people and not been able to sort of mobilize around it. So I don't sort of automatically feel hopeful about these things without being sure that there is a sort of, critical mass of people being built around thinking that this is important and this is something we need to take forward. So I'll say I have, work ahead, and I have sort of action points on how to do it, but I don't automatically feel hopeful about that on its own. I feel very hopeful about the country in many different ways. I mean, I feel immensely hopeful by talking to young people all the time, anywhere across the board. I don't think that it's hard to. I'm sure at a broad national level, it's hard to change minds, but at the individual level, you really do get that sense of feeling that you can appeal to people's better nature, and the fact that that better nature is not is there. It's just sometimes there's propaganda, there's so many other things that sort of come in the way of it. So I do feel hopeful that if enough people come around to deciding something's important and then sort of investing energy in it and trying to convince people of it, that there can be that these good things can happen. But I don't think any of it is automatic or easy.
I think that's something for all of us to hold on to and maybe actively work towards as a group of women in economics and policy. With that, I think we'll wrap up the session, Rukmini. I really have to extend my heartfelt gratitude from not only the executive members, but also all the team that has joined us today for taking out the time and engaging with us so deeply and giving us such an insightful talk. I'm sure I speak for everybody when I say this has been one of the most engaging talks we've been a part of. And while the reality is something that is far from idealistic, we hope that, with work from you and from other stalwarts in the field, that we can move towards this reality sooner than later. So thank you so much, Rukmini, for the time that you've taken and for the talk, for the wonderful talk that you've given. Thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. The chat box questions were quite insightful, and we're okay to wrap up the session. Thank you, everybody, and please stay safe, and hopefully we can connect soon on a new event.
Thank you so much, Ayushi. Great questions from you and from everyone in the chat. Real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rukmini. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.